Michael Cockerell's remarkable and powerful insight into a decade of power now on BBC Two, the second part of Blair, the Inside Story.
It will be 10 years this May since Tony Blair became Prime Minister. In his very first month in office, he made a remarkable speech.
Mine is the first generation able to contemplate the possibility that we may live our entire lives without going to war or sending our children to war.
He has now sent our troops into battle more often than any previous Prime Minister since the Second World War.
Having had the experience of doing it once, you can draw on that experience, and I think it gives you greater confidence, you have to do it a second or third time.
I think Tony got the taste for war in Kosovo. It made him a heroic figure.
Blair was greeted as a saviour after helping liberate Kosovo from the Serbs. In the second of this three-part series, I'll be showing how Tony Blair's burning sense of mission has repeatedly led him to war. I mean, do you see him as a man with a mission?
Oh yeah. I mean, mission has a kind of religious overtone to it, doesn't it? It's doing what you think is right, isn't it? And I think that's what motivates Blair above all else. He's not a man who walks on the other side of the street.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, accompanied by Prime Minister Tony Blair.
On Blair's first trip to Washington as Prime Minister, President Clinton had brought him to the aptly named Blair High School. The two leaders were politically so close that they might have been twins who'd been separated at birth.
There was a high school band playing furiously, terrific noise. The buzz was absolutely fantastic. And there were these two men, Clinton and Blair, sort of youngish, almost dressed in identical blue suits. What came into my head was the Blues Brothers. You know, these boys, they're going to go on stage and they're going to perform.
I've just been given something I want to show you. Here we are.
You could tell that they both lit up when they were in each other's presence, and that the passion, even on the phone, you know, where just the lilt in President Clinton's voice when it was Tony on the phone, you know, there was you could just tell that it was always important and brightened his day.
You had sexual relations with the President?
The Monica Lewinsky affair was dominating American politics during Blair's visit to a stormy Washington. Clinton was fighting for his political life, and Blair had to decide how he should play it. Not for the last time, Blair calculated that the way he could best strengthen the special relationship was to come to the aid of a beleaguered president. For all Clinton's public show of insouciance, the president knew he might soon have to resign in disgrace.
Could I ask the Prime Minister, some people have been struck by the warmth of the personal statements of support that you've given to the President. Could I ask you, I mean, have you ever considered that that might be a politically risky strategy? And could I ask the President, have you appreciated those comments from Mr. Blair?
You know, to be quite honest, Phil, I mean, I've said it because I've believed it and because I think it is the right thing to do. And I've worked with President Clinton now for some 9 months as British Prime Minister. I have found him throughout someone I could trust, someone I could rely upon, someone I am proud to call, not just a colleague but a friend.
You asked, do I appreciate it? No, he should have come here and jumped all over me. I mean,
Blair gave his answer, and it killed the issue stone dead for the rest of the press conference, and they were able to get on and talk about talk about other things.
No question that Blair's being there was emotionally supportive for President Clinton. I mean, both personally and having somebody who, shared and was sympathetic to him, but also somebody who was sort of publicly willing to be seen and associated with President Clinton. That was clearly a positive thing. Clinton clearly appreciated it very much, and the fact that there was no, hint of shying away from this, or maybe I don't want to be associated with President Clinton at this time.
We had a wonderful relationship that was both political and personal. We just liked each other, and I'm crazy about his wife. I like his kids. A very, very nice relationship.
Tony Blair also wanted to have a very, very nice relationship with the leaders of Europe, who went on a bike ride at his first Euro summit.
Tony Blair was first into the saddle, and every single head of government of the European Union wanted to be photographed with Tony, because he was young and good-looking and hugely, hugely successful. And Tony made sure that he was the first person to arrive at the lunch venue. And of course, these things work. I mean, it's a great photograph. And if the British Prime Minister is out ahead of the rest of the field, well, we can all say, well, that's 10-0 to us, kind of thing.
The leaders of the West and Russia came together for an historic meeting during Blair's first month as Prime Minister. The Cold War had ended, and Blair captured the optimistic mood as Boris Yeltsin became the first Russian leader ever to attend a summit of NATO, the West's military alliance.
Mine is the first generation, able to contemplate the possibility that we may live our entire lives without going to war or sending our children to war. That is a prize beyond value.
But that prize moved far out of reach with a military action in Kosovo, ordered by the Serbian strongman Slobodan Milosevic. The homes of thousands of ethnic Albanians were systematically destroyed and torched. Milosevic's policy was called ethnic cleansing. Up to 1.5 million refugees fled their country to escape from the Serbian soldiers' campaign of torture, rape and massacre. Vast refugee camps were set up outside Kosovo, and Tony Blair led the calls for decisive action by the West against Serbia. But Milosevic was greeted as a national hero in Belgrade, for the Serbs have a near mystical regard for Kosovo as the birthplace of their nation, and Milosevic vows he will not be moved. NATO agree on airstrikes against the Serbs, led by the Americans and the British.
I can tell you that the longest hours of any Prime Minister's life are those spent waiting to hear that the crews sent into battle are back safely. I would never expose our brave servicemen and women to those risks unless I believed that I had to. We are doing what is right for a world that must know that barbarity cannot be allowed to defeat justice. This is simply the right thing to do.
That phrase, the right thing to do, is one that the Prime Minister would use repeatedly over the coming years. But the NATO bombing of Belgrade is not bringing Milosevic to heel, and Blair wants to step up the campaign. At a meeting in Washington, he finds his friend Clinton in uncooperative mood. The President had ruled out the use of ground troops against Milosevic.
One of Blair's objectives was to try to persuade Clinton that without damaging the credibility of the air campaign, by God, we had to start making contingency plans for a ground war against the possibility that bombing from the air would not do the trick. And Blair got a horrid surprise when we all met in the private quarters of the White House to discuss how to bring the Serbs to heel. It was Sandy Berger, who was the National Security Advisor, doing all the talking. But Clinton sitting there almost silent the whole time, chewing on an unlit cigar, which apparently was something he liked to do. And the Americans weren't having it. And they were unshakable. They were unmovable.
Blair goes to see for himself the conditions in the Kosovan refugee camps. His become more convinced that the only way to dislodge Milosevic from Kosovo is by NATO committing to the use of ground troops. Blair wants to ask the local NATO commander, who happens to be the British General Sir Mike Jackson, about whether a land invasion could succeed and at what cost in British lives.
I can remember very clearly indeed. We were under a camouflage net on the edge of a training area where a lot of the British forces were based. We did talk about a possible casualty estimate. I used the analogy of the Falklands with the Prime Minister. And I said, at worst, we may be looking at a butcher's bill, something in the line of the Falklands, which was 255 servicemen were killed in action in the Falklands and well over 1,000 wounded.
Also in the tent was the Chief of all Britain's armed forces, General Guthrie. He saw how Blair reacted to Jackson's worst-case scenario of the British death toll.
He was very worried about it, because it's a political problem, but also it's a problem because he's a human being who didn't want to see other people killed. So he did ask about it, but he was not what I would say casualty averse, like I think President Clinton was at that time. He realized that sometimes in war people do lose their lives and it's unavoidable. And if you always try and avoid it, you probably aren't going to do very well.
Blair was greeted as a saviour by the refugees from Kosovo. They saw his strong stand in NATO as their one hope for returning home.
This is not a battle for territory. This is a battle for humanity. It is a just cause. It is a rightful cause.
Anybody would have left a visit to one of those camps thinking this is the right thing, morally the right thing to be doing, without doubt. And you are more determined, not less, you are more determined.
And then you saw a transformation of Tony. He went on visits, he had pictures taken sitting in front of tents of refugees. He put on a red top, he never wears red, and black trousers because those are the Albanian colours. People were shouting, Tony, Tony, NATO, NATO. Lots of babies called Tony were born. He was on the stage. And it was a more dramatic and powerful stage than ever before.
With every ploy that Milosevic tries, our determination to defeat him is deepened. There are no half measures to his brutality. There can be no half measures as to how we respond to it. No compromise, no fudge, no half-baked deals.
The Prime Minister was developing a radical new Blair doctrine of the moral case for intervening by force against evil across the whole world.
It is only if we stand up to be counted in the cause of justice that every other would-be dictator in the world will know that the international community will not stand by and let them kill at will, destabilize a region, destroy a people.
Back in number 10, Blair finds himself increasingly out on a limb over Kosovo. He tries again to persuade Clinton to change his mind over ground troops, but the president makes it clear that he will not be pushed around by the British.
It looked as though there was a real danger that President Clinton and European allies might slither into some sort of fudged formula with Milosevic. And I said to him, I think there's a real risk that you're going to be left out on a limb and you'll find everyone else is in favour of a wording and you're on your own. And have you thought what you're going to do if you find yourself in that position? And he said, I will be right, and if I am right, I will say that I'm right, and I'm not afraid of standing out on my own. And I was very struck by that certainty and by that determination and by that willpower that his viewpoint was the right one and must win.
Blair now decided to send thousands more British troops to join the NATO contingent on the Kosovan border. And with Clinton softening his own stance on ground troops under pressure from Blair, the Russians now stepped up their diplomatic pressure on their ally Milosevic. The Serbian strongman suddenly buckled. That night, Tony Blair was having a tete-a-tete dinner with one of his closest cabinet colleagues.
It was one of those rare occasions where you're eating with the Prime Minister alone, no advisors, no one else present. And suddenly the phone rings and the news comes through that Milosevic is capitulating. And I said, this is an occasion to rejoice in. You've achieved something that other Prime Ministers would have given their right arm for. At that moment his son Nicky came into the room having done his homework, and I said to Nicky, hug your dad, because he's literally contributed to saving tens of thousands of lives, and you should be very proud of him. And he did.
We cannot rest until the refugees are home. But then, truly, we will be able to say that good has triumphed over evil, justice has overcome barbarism, and the values of civilization have prevailed.
I have no doubt that he was convinced in his own mind. Not only was it strategically, in a rather more calculating way, if you like, the right thing to be doing, but morally it was the right thing to be doing.
And where do you think that this sense he has, you said, a strong sense of what is right morally, where do you think this comes from?
Well, I know that he is an avowed Christian, and therefore those Christian principles are probably deep in his makeup.
People underestimate how important religion is to Tony. He's someone who reads a lot of religious books. That's what he enjoys doing in his spare time. I remember once suggesting I get him some novels to read on his summer holiday, and he said no, he wanted to really read religious books, so he phoned up the library at number 10 and asked for some very obscure 12th century book on Christianity to take to the beach with him. So religion matters to him a lot. He thinks about it a lot. He reads a lot of religious books. On occasions I think people encourage him not to show the religious side of him because they think people aren't basically religious and won't warm to it. But I think it's the authentic Tony, and clearly deep within him are a set of beliefs that do in part come from religion.
Blair's press secretary Alistair Campbell told a journalist who sought to question Blair about his Christianity, "We don't do God." And when I interviewed the Prime Minister after Kosovo, I asked him why he seemed so reluctant to discuss his religious beliefs in public.
Well, I never like going on about this because people think you're trying to sort of paint God into the picture or any of the rest of it. And I mean, I am what I am. I'm a practicing Christian, and that's part of me. There's no point in denying it. But I suppose that the thing that has come out most of my politics that's derived from belief is the concept of values. That is what politics is about.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's anything to worry about or to apologise at all.
Well, I'm glad you think so. But my experience ever of trying to talk about this is that someone always misconstrues it.
I mean, do you see him as a man with a mission?
Oh, yeah. I mean, mission has a kind of religious overtone to it, doesn't it? But that's not so far from him. I look at Tony Blair, we're all shaped by our experiences. And I think there's a Christian's approach to being fair and being right. And I think that's what motivates Blair above all else. He's not a man who walks on the other side of the street.
Blair's success in Kosovo had intensified his belief that using military might in a moral cause could be a noble enterprise, and by ordering British servicemen to risk their lives in war, he'd crossed a hugely significant frontier for any Prime Minister.
When you've made that decision for the first time to commit force in the pursuit of your political objectives, you thereby learn. You have a confidence which wouldn't have been there on that first occasion when you think, I've never done this before. But having had the experience of doing it once, you can draw on that experience, and I think it gives you greater confidence, if you have to do it a second or third time.
I think Tony got the taste for war in Kosovo. It made him a heroic figure. I think the policy was right. It could have been better executed. It should never have been indicated that you won't go on the ground. That just prolongs the length of the resistance. And it was Russia and France that brought it to an end. But Tony got lots of credibility and stature out of that.
It's undoubtedly the case that Tony Blair found there less constraints on the world stage. In domestic policy, you're always battling either with the Treasury or with other departments, and it's quite messy and there's slow progress, and it takes years and years to turn around the health service. It's a bit more clear-cut on the world stage. You have to decide whether to go to war or not. You're meeting other individuals and coming up with solutions or bold statements of your plan of action. So I think he found it less constraining being on the world stage.
The West African country of Sierra Leone provided the Prime Minister with a new stage for the Blair doctrine of using military force for moral ends. The Sierra Leone government had been engaged in a long-running conflict with rebel militias. The fighting escalated into a particularly vicious civil war. Young children would lose their limbs because the opposing forces would cut them off. In 2000, the fighting reached the capital, Freetown, with the rebels threatening to overthrow the elected government, and Blair decided to send troops to evacuate British citizens. The Chief of the Defence Staff, General Guthrie, a former SAS commander, arrived in Freetown to oversee operations. But some weeks later, 11 British soldiers were captured by one of the rebel groups.
We had a very unfortunate incident when a number of soldiers were taken hostage by the West Side boys, who were a particularly nasty lot, high on drugs, murderers, mutilators of children. Horrible lot, and we were extremely worried.
The British soldiers were being held somewhere in the bush, and the army had a fair idea of the location. But General Guthrie, as he went to brief Tony Blair, knew that any rescue mission would be extremely risky given the volatility of their captors.
He had the option to do nothing and to continue negotiating and run the risk of these people being killed, tortured, or split up in different parts of Sierra Leone. Or he could do something, and he had the resources to do it, but there was a big risk of that if it went wrong. And I remember him saying, you know, what is the risk? Is it dangerous? And I said, very, very dangerous. How many people are we going to get killed? I said, well, I don't know, but I'd be surprised if somebody's not killed. And he made a decision just like that. Yes, we'll do it, which I admired him enormously for doing.
Blair agreed to send in the SAS.
They got hostages out. One British soldier lost his life. They killed a lot of West Side boys who were one of the rebel groups, and it changed the whole psychology of the rebellion. The sense that the Brits were engaging, using military force and killing people, the game was up.
This was an operation carried out in circumstances of immense danger, in the face of armed resistance, and I cannot pay high enough tribute to the skill, the professionalism, and above all the courage of the armed forces involved. There literally are no finer armed forces anywhere in the world.
Sierra Leone fortified Blair's belief in the can-do skills of British servicemen, and his own sense of mission about using force for moral purposes across the world grew even stronger. And the Prime Minister felt that his relationship with the new American president would be key to implementing the Blair doctrine. But the new man was advised by neo-conservatives whose aim was to build up America's military strength and global leadership. On his first visit to see President Bush...
And it's one of the genius of Tony Blair. His antennae are quivering, and these radio waves are going out from his head, and they're looking for the signal. And he found George W.'s signal very fast and locked on, and found his wavelength. Meantime, George W., you know, he's a politician's politician as well. So you can see these two men, you know, looking for each other's signals, and they locked on almost simultaneously.
A question for both of you. There's been a lot said about how different you are as people. Have you already in your talks found some personal interests that you have in common, maybe in religion or sport or music?
Well, we both use Colgate toothpaste.
They're going to wonder how you know that, George. Yeah, the really alarming thing about that was that it happened to be true, because I went back I went back and checked the toothpaste afterwards, and yes it was, but I don't know.
In the first months, there was little to suggest that the Blair-Bush relationship had a genuine ring of confidence to it. But then came the events of savage September.
When something of such terrible force and impact hits your country, and he'd only been president for a very short space of time, it is a huge responsibility that then falls upon him.
This is a terrible moment. But this country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy that came upon America.
It was important that he knew that I understood a little bit of what he was going through. And one of the things that I was most determined about right from the outset after September the 11th was that America shouldn't feel that when its moment of crisis came and it was subject to this brutal and vindictive attack, that the world stood apart from them and said, well, that's your problem, you deal with it.
Often adversity produces closeness, and Tony went to the US. He famously stood with the president.
One of the first phone calls I got after that terrible day was from the Prime Minister. He was reassuring to me.
And Tony came to symbolize the support of the rest of the world, and was able to articulate that support brilliantly.
My father's generation went through the experience of the Second World War when Britain was under attack during the days of the Blitz. And there was one nation and one people that above all stood side by side with us at that time. And that nation was America, and those people were the American people. And I say to you, we stand side by side with you now, without hesitation.
Blair then flew round the world to try to build up support for Bush's planned war on terror. Blair was the president's international travelling salesman because of his profound belief in the special relationship. One of the things that is said, a former American Secretary of State said that in that moment of crisis, one of the elements in the special relationship, as far as America is concerned, is that Britain is prepared to send troops to commit themselves to, as he put it in a graphic phrase, to pay the blood price. I mean, do you recognise that?
Yes, I mean, what's important too is at that moment of crisis, they don't need to know simply that you're giving general expressions of support and sympathy. I mean, that's easy, frankly. They need to know you're prepared to commit. You're prepared to be there. And when the shooting starts, you're prepared to be there.
Blair sent troops to Afghanistan to help the Americans oust the Taliban and to aid in the search for Osama bin Laden.
We're fighting them. And one by one, we're bringing them to justice.
The Prime Minister's resolute support for the American president and his war on terror turned Blair himself into a target for terrorists.
There was a threat against the Prime Minister over the Queen's Jubilee period of time, and
an assassination threat.
It was an assassination threat, yes, and there was good reasons for believing that that threat was credible.
The climax of the Queen's Golden Jubilee was a huge royal street party in the Mall, but the big question for the police was whether her Prime Minister should attend such a public event.
I certainly went to Number 10, spoke to the Prime Minister, and we talked about public appearances and the like. Now, he was absolutely determined he was going to go ahead with the public appearances, and said to me, John, I'm quite sure you'll do everything that's necessary as you have done in the past. I have to say, I think he was probably more optimistic about all of that than I was, because I certainly had a dread that anything would happen to him or anybody that was surrounding him at that time. So we went ahead with it, and as a result we had a lot of police officers around, a lot of marksmen around the actual vicinity. I remember sitting with him 3 or 4 along the line outside Buckingham Palace, where we knew we were extremely vulnerable. I just looked out of the side of my eyes there, and there was not the shadow of any kind of fear or anything. He had a job to do and did it.
Saddam Hussein, the one-time ally of the West, had now become the #1 target for Bush and Blair in the war on terror. The two leaders said that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, and the threat must be dealt with before it became lethal reality. In the summer of 2002, 9 months before the Iraq War began, I went to interview Blair. It quickly became clear to me that rather than being a poodle, Blair's own moral certainties made him, if anything, the president's gun dog.
The one thing we have learnt, surely, after September the 11th, is not to wait till the threat materialises before acting upon it. Now, we're not at the stage of decision on Iraq, and there are all sorts of different ways that we might decide to deal with the actual threat that it poses. I am very reluctant ever to get into military action, but there are some times in which it's inevitable. And so when I say that this is an issue that have to be dealt with, and I said that, as I say, 3 days after September the 11th, I mean it, not because America thinks it's important. I think it's important. I think Britain thinks it's important, or Britain should think it's important, because it's a real issue.
He genuinely believed, as we all did, Saddam Hussein was a nasty person and better got rid of. He did believe that after 9/11 in particular, it was important not to let the Americans kind of go their own way without influence from others in Europe, us in particular. But in the end, I think he was also a bit kind of seduced by the special relationship, which is a very seductive one, and I think that he found it difficult to distinguish between British interest and American interest.
Back in London, Blair looked for evidence to convince the British public of the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. As Prime Minister, he would receive top-secret intelligence briefings from our international spy network. Tony Blair now made the unprecedented decision to publish a dossier drawn up by Britain's intelligence chiefs, headed by MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service.
I'm aware, of course, that people are going to have to take elements of this on the good faith of our intelligence services. But this is what they are telling me, the British Prime Minister, and my senior colleagues. The intelligence picture they paint is one accumulated over the last 4 years. It is extensive, detailed, and authoritative.
That dossier was to prove hugely controversial in the months to come. The following year, Blair was forced to bring in Lord Butler, the former Cabinet Secretary, to investigate the use the Prime Minister had made of intelligence.
My criticism was that the intelligence community told him that they believed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, was going to acquire more, but they told him that the intelligence on which this was based was thin. And my criticism was not that Tony Blair said that he believed that Saddam was acquiring these things. I think he did believe it. But he didn't tell us what the intelligence community told him, that the intelligence was sporadic and patchy. But I've no doubt they believed it.
But if it's sporadic and patchy, I just wonder how you can account for the fact that Tony Blair uses sporadic and patchy evidence but doesn't present it in that way, presents it in a much more convincing way, in a way designed to persuade people.
Well, he was giving a lead to the public and to the wider world and to the United Nations in a cause in which he believed.
In Europe, where Blair had said he wanted to be the crucial bridge with America, his pro-Bush stance over Iraq was not going down well among many of its top leaders. At an EU meeting in October 2002, France and Germany led the doubters. President Chirac challenged Blair directly in the meeting about the case for war against Saddam.
I remember Chirac saying, Leo, the Prime Minister's young son, Leo will not thank you if you take Britain into war. And I remember, we all kind of picked our jawbones up off the floor, because this was such a kind of brazen thing to say. And it kind of knocked Tony Blair back a bit, but he didn't respond to that particular comment. And Chirac then went on to say that Chirac had experience of war. He had been in the war in Algeria as a French serviceman, and therefore knew that war was a brutal thing. And then he went on to say why he thought that even though Saddam Hussein could be overthrown, the subsequent consequences would be disastrous.
Je considère que la guerre, c'est toujours la plus mauvaise des solutions. J'ajoute que je trouve que dans cette région, on n'a pas besoin d'une guerre supplémentaire.
And one of the things, particularly in retrospect, that strikes me is that Tony Blair never paid any attention to what Chirac had said. I mean, he didn't come away from those meetings saying, we ought to think about what Chirac has said. Maybe he's got a point. He'd kind of come out rolling his eyes and saying, oh, dear old Jacques, he doesn't get it, does he?
In early 2003, Number 10 produced another anti-Saddam dossier. Masterminded by Alistair Campbell, the dossier was quickly discredited as public skepticism grew about the government's case for action against Iraq. The decision to deploy armoured cars that looked like tanks at Heathrow Airport aroused great public suspicion. Many people wondered whether there was a real threat of terrorist attack, or whether it was the Number 10 spin machine that was behind the decision.
We put in what we call the Ring of Steel around Heathrow, armoured cars, because there was a threat of actually missiles being used on the approaches into Heathrow. We knew that. We had specific intelligence on that. There was incredible cynicism that this had all been done, engineered by the Prime Minister, to ensure that this would help in terms of his credibility and the credibility of the government.
Political correspondents I'd known for 30 years said, but that's just Alistair Campbell softening us up for a war. It wasn't. It was for real. But because Number 10 put it out, as it were, the explanations of it, or the government information machine did, people who've been around for decades, even they thought, what are they really up to? Why are they really doing this? Instead of taking it at face value.
So why do you think there was this level of cynicism by the public about the Prime Minister's motivations in terms of playing up the terrorist threat?
Well, I think it's the business of spin, isn't it? You know, this so-called spin that's put out, which actually is telling untruths or being not quite as truthful as people should be. And I think, you know, we've got to be very careful with that. I think that will have an effect on politicians' credibility and the government's credibility.
Blair himself decided to confront opponents of the war in the TV studios in what Alistair Campbell called the masochism strategy.
Just one more point, Mr. Blair. You are a man that has come across in our country, and I know I've spoken to lots of women. They said, this man, he comes across as a genuine man, a family-orientated man. A man who's not only a Christian, but a church-going Christian. Now, to me, Mr. Blair, what you're going to do, and I'm sure you're going to do it, you and Mr. Bush, you're going to go and now bomb Iraq, and it's not dissimilar to what Bin Laden or the Al-Qaeda network done to America.
Whenever you take military action, it is true that innocent people die as well as guilty ones, but sometimes you have to take that action if it's the only way of dealing with the threat that is there.
There was huge pressure on Tony before the Iraq War, because he knew that so many people, particularly in the party, didn't support it and didn't support how close he was to George Bush. There were a number of us at Number 10 who thought he was overly close to George Bush, but that didn't mean that, he thought he was doing the right thing, and it wasn't for him a matter of whether Bush was a Republican or not. The question was this, broadly speaking, the right thing to do, and he believed it was.
In the run-up to the Iraq War, Did you have doubts about going to war against Iraq, and did you express those doubts to the Prime Minister?
We all had doubts about it. I mean, the Prime Minister had doubts about it because war is a last resort. But there's a kind of myth around that he was kind of gung-ho for military action. He wasn't gung-ho for military action. He was more aware than anybody of the responsibility on him.
You're the captain of the ship, you can't show the crew you're concerned. When I used to see him coming in with all these big problems, he kept focused, kept on going, and despite all the difficulties, I think he always felt this was right, and I'm doing what's right, and that gives you a great deal of comfort in those difficult decisions when you can't always be sure whether you're right or wrong. And there are some times when I say, well, thank God I didn't have to make the decision. But I'm party to it, so I don't walk away from it.
Tony Blair had always promised there would be United Nations backing for military action against Saddam. And in the spring of 2003, there was feverish activity and scrabbling for votes by the British in the Security Council. They wanted a second UN resolution that would ratchet up the pressure against Saddam.
Why we tried a second resolution was that the only way we could conceive of diverting this whole saga from conflict, from the use of military force, was to maximize the amount of, I would say, unanimous Security Council pressure on Saddam to give up without a fight. I think that the Prime Minister was extremely disappointed not to have specific UN backing. And I think that I didn't serve him particularly well in that we didn't get the second resolution.
With many countries opposed to war against Iraq, a second resolution proved impossible. And inside Number 10, the blame game began.
I recall the moment because I happened to be in the corridor in Number 10 when he and Alistair Campbell were walking down the corridor, and they decided effectively to play the anti-French card. And they'd been given an opportunity to do so because President Chirac had given a broadcast interview the previous day in which he had said that as of that moment France would veto a resolution authorizing war.
Quelles que soient les circonstances, la France votera non parce qu'elle considère ce soir qu'il n'y a pas lieu de faire une guerre pour atteindre l'objectif que nous nous sommes fixés, c'est-à-dire le désarmement de l'Irak.
He did not say that France would always veto such a resolution, but the story was spun by Number 10 as if that's what he had said, i.e. that France would never ever agree to the overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
Now normally it's the French who engage in the dog ate my homework diplomacy, but on that occasion it was us that was doing it, and I think it was pretty embarrassing to pretend that it was all because of a throwaway line of President Chirac's in a press conference or in an interview.
Blair knew his party was deeply split on Iraq, and if he couldn't persuade a majority of his own MPs to back the war, it would mean the end for him.
You would get a sense from talking to those in Number 10 around the Prime Minister how fearful they were that they might not survive a vote in the House of Commons.
You mean they were packing their bags?
They were, I think, examining what was in their drawers to see how easily it was portable, because he was on a knife edge.
Despite playing the anti-French card, Blair could still not be sure that he would get the support of most of his own MPs in the big vote on going to war with Iraq. He knew, though, he could count on the support of the Tories.
It is the duty of the government to act in the national interest. I believe that the Prime Minister is acting in the national interest today. This is why he is entitled to our support.
This is not the time to falter. This is the time for this House, not just this government or indeed this Prime Minister, but for this House to give a lead. To show that we will stand up for what we know to be right. To show that we will confront the tyrannies and dictatorships and terrorists who put our way of life at risk. To show at the moment of decision that we have the courage to do the right thing. I beg to move the motion.
Doing the right thing again won the day. And as Blair prepared to tell the nation it was going to war, he sought his press secretary Alistair Campbell's advice on how he should address the British people.
Well, Tony Blair said to Alistair, well, how do you think we should start this broadcast? And Alistair said, well, you could start by saying, my fellow Americans. And to which Tony said, your sense of humour may get you in trouble one day.
The land war itself was short and sharp. The American high-speed race across the desert took them straight to Baghdad, where they met little resistance. Tony Blair arrived in Basra with the war seemingly won within a month. Saddam had been overthrown, our troops had performed well and had taken few casualties from enemy action. For Blair, who developed the doctrine of using military might against dictators across the world, it looked like a famous victory.
When people look back on this time and look back on this conflict, I honestly believe they will see this as one of the defining moments of our century. And you did it. It was your courage and your professionalism that did it.
In the days following the victory of 9 April, no one, it seems to me, was instructed to put the security of Iraq first, to put law and order on the streets first. There was no police force, there was no constituted army except the victorious invaders. And there was no American general that I have ever been able to establish who was given the accountable responsibility to make sure that the first duty of any government, and we were the government, was to keep law and order on the streets. There was a vacuum from the beginning into which the looters, the saboteurs, the criminals, the insurgents moved very quickly.
The Pentagon had told the British that American troops would be greeted as liberators and garlanded with flowers. But post-war Iraq was not following the neocon script. Baghdad 2003 was not exactly Paris 1944, although they were still starry-eyed in Washington.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
In the summer of 2003, Tony Blair was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. He was the first British Prime Minister since Winston Churchill to be so honoured.
You know, my middle son was studying 18th century history in the American War of Independence, and he said to me the other day, you know Lord North, Dad, he was the British Prime Minister who lost us America. So just think, however many mistakes you'll make, you'll never make one that bad. Members of Congress, I feel a most urgent sense of mission about today's world. September the 11th was not an isolated event, but a tragic prologue. Iraq another act, and many further struggles will be set upon this stage before it's over. There never has been a time when the power of America was so necessary or so misunderstood.
Blair had succeeded in his prime aim of getting as close as he could to the American president. New Labour and the neocons had united in fighting the war on terror.
Good afternoon. It is once again a pleasure to welcome the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and Cherie Blair to the White House. Mr. Prime Minister, fabulous speech. Congratulations.
Although Bush would be fulsome in his praise of his best buddy and staunch ally Tony Blair, the two leaders' specially close relationship provided rich material for the media and the satirists in Britain.
I love that word relationship. It covers all manner of sins, doesn't it? I fear that this has become a bad relationship. A relationship based on the president taking exactly what he wants and casually ignoring all those things that really matter to Britain. We may be a small country, but we're a great one too. A country of Shakespeare, Churchill, the Beatles, Sean Connery, Harry Potter. And a friend who bullies us is no longer a friend. And since bullies only respond to strength, from now onward, I will be prepared to be much stronger. And the president should be prepared for that.
That scene was greeted in cinemas across the country by cheering and audiences bursting into applause. It was something that the media-savvy real Prime Minister wasn't slow to latch onto.
You know, I know there's a bit of us that would like me to do a Hugh Grant and Love Actually and tell America where to get off. But the difference between a good film and real life is that in real life there's the next day, the next year, the next lifetime to contemplate the ruinous consequences of easy applause. You know, I never doubted after September the 11th that our place was alongside America. And I don't doubt it now.
Tony gave his word to Bush that he'd be with him all the way on Iraq very, very early on. And that's a tragedy, because his potential greatness would have been to say, yes, we need to deal with Iraq, the sanctions, the defiance of the UN, the hurt to the people, but let's do it right. Let's keep the world together. And if he hadn't given his word with no conditions, he might well have saved the world from the mess it's in and America from the error that it's in.
Back up! Back up! As the security situation in Iraq rapidly worsened in the months after the invasion, the big question was whether Blair was having any real influence at all on the Americans in reconstructing the country.
One of the reasons why I think that the input of the Prime Minister to the President wasn't fully used or didn't get through to the capillaries was that it wasn't the White House that was making the tactical decisions. It was the Pentagon under Donald Rumsfeld. They may have heard the advice, but they made their own decisions. Even if the Prime Minister had persuaded the President, it didn't seem to get through into decisions on the ground via the Pentagon.
Donald Rumsfeld and other top Pentagon officials had proclaimed proudly to their British opposite numbers, "We don't do peace, and we don't do nation building." General Sir Mike Jackson, the head of the British Army, which famously does do nation building and post-war reconstruction, visited Basra. He saw for himself the problems Blair faced in seeking to influence US policy in post-war Iraq.
The difficulty in a coalition like that is that, of course, Britain was very much the junior partner. It's a difficult position to be in, because you may want to do something differently, but if your large partner cannot or will not be persuaded that your way is the right way, you will finish up, of course, a bit frustrated.
Do you think that Tony Blair has been frustrated by...
I have no doubt he's been frustrated. I have no doubt.
Oh, he was tearing his hair from time to time at the things that couldn't be done more quickly. He wanted a new police force up and running within months. But he felt that we would go through a dark period, we would have some difficulties, but it would break out and come right. And people around the Prime Minister are very conscious of this sense of right judgment, of mission. But he didn't focus enough on the means of delivering what he wanted. He didn't quite concentrate enough on the instruments for delivering the final result that was needed in Iraq. And that's perhaps where he took his eye off the ball.
In Downing Street, 5 months after the invasion, questions for Blair were mounting.
Good morning, everyone.
When I interviewed you last year, you accepted that one of the elements in the special relationship was that Britain sometimes had to pay the blood price. I just wonder, a year on, with the war in Iraq, the loss of life of British troops, the loss of trust in you, the loss of 2 cabinet ministers, the fractured relationship with your own party, and what's seen on the ground as a desperate mess in Iraq, what you feel now about the price that you have had to pay for your unflinching support of President George Bush?
Firstly, it's not the price I paid. I mean, the price has been paid by British and American soldiers, by Iraqis. But you should also understand this. The reason that I supported the action in Iraq was not because I thought we simply had to support America. It's because I thought it was right. I still think it's right. I think the link between terrorism and rogue states with weapons of mass destruction is the crucial security threat of the 21st century. And I believe that. I'm not
I'm not infallible in the judgments that I make, of course I'm not. And there'll be other people who strongly disagree with that, but that's what I believe.
Basra provided graphic images of the problems facing British troops. Angry locals had used petrol bombs against an armoured vehicle. One British soldier climbed out to be pelted by the crowd. And 3 other soldiers only just escaped with their lives.
You've been called a liar and a warmonger and all that sort of thing. What's your feeling, your attitude when that happens? And also too, when you read of casualties and people blame you for those casualties, I mean, that's a terrible, awful thing to live with, and I wondered how you coped with it.
Well, it is, but it's even more difficult for the people out on the front line doing the job.
Of course.
And that's what you have to remember. But
you sent them there?
Yeah, and that decision has to be taken and has to be lived with. And in the end, there is a judgment that, well, I think if you have faith about these things, then you realise that judgment is made by other people. And also by...
What do you mean by that? Sorry.
I mean, by other people, if you believe in God, it's made by God as well. And that judgment in the end has to be, you do your... When you're faced with a decision like that, and some of those decisions have been very, very difficult. As I say, most of all because there are people's lives, not just, this isn't a matter of a policy here or a thing there, but their lives, and in some case, their death. The only way you can take a decision like that is to try to do the right thing according to your conscience.
Now that the Prime Minister has used up all mortal excuses for his folly in invading Iraq and is relying on divine guidance, will he tell us which archangel is now beckoning him towards southern Afghanistan?
Right. So what's the answer?
Well, I don't think Tony Blair at one time was lampooned by some for his faith, ever actually turned to God and said, please give me the answer. I think his faith actually carried him through the most difficult times when, not just with self-belief and a sense of purpose, but with the sustaining of that faith, was able to actually maintain that missionary zeal, that belief that there is a better tomorrow, that things can actually be better than they are today, and that there is more than simply being in office to being Prime Minister.
He's a hell of a guy. You think he's one of the most attacks, and then he turns up bubbling and smiling, and I say, God blimey, how can you be smiling when all this is going on? But he does, and he manages it, and that, I think, it's a kind of inner faith in him that arrives at a lot of those conclusions.
Tony Blair had come to power proclaiming that his could be the first generation where not a single British soldier was sent to war. But he ordered our troops into battle 5 times in his first 6 years as Prime Minister. And our servicemen are still fighting and dying in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's Iraq that's been the most damaging to his reputation. But Tony Blair remains completely unrepentant. The fiercer the attacks are. Next week, with time fast running out for Tony Blair, we tell the remarkable inside story of his final years in office. His sudden heart problems, the aftermath of Iraq, cash for honours, his troubles with Gordon, the plots to overthrow him, and his increasingly frantic search for a legacy. That's part 3 of Blair, the inside story, next Tuesday at 9 o'clock on BBC 2.